Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining today's meeting to discuss the cybersecurity risk assessment led by Team Canada. We will be identifying risk and vulnerabilities that led to the attack that occurred at the summit. Topics will include current measures with authentication, authorization, and access control, vulnerabilities and threats, attack vectors, attribution analysis, vulnerability analysis, and we'll conclude with some recommendations. Authentication is a process by which you verify that someone is who they claim they are. Authentication is important because it enables organizations to keep their network secure by permitting only authenticated users to access its protected resources. There are three common factors used for authentication. First is something you know, which can be a password or a PIN. Next is something you have, like a smart card or a security token. And lastly, something you are. This is considered a biometric that includes things such as fingerprints or iris scans. Authenticating a user with a user ID and a password is usually considered the most basic type of authentication, and it depends on the user knowing two pieces of information, the user ID or username and the password. Since this type of authentication relies on just one authentication factor, it is a type of single-factor authentication. Adding authentication factors to the authentication process typically improves security. Strong authentication usually refers to authentication that uses at least two factors, where those factors are of different types. Two-factor authentication usually depends on the knowledge factor combined with either a biometric factor or a possession factor like a security token. Multi-factor authentication can include any type of authentication that depends on two or more factors. Once authenticated, a user or process is usually subjected to an authorization process as well to determine whether the authenticated entity should be permitted access to a protective resource or system. A user can be authenticated but fail to be given access to a resource if that user was not granted permission to access it. Authorization is the process of establishing if the user who is already authenticated is permitted to have access to a resource. Authorization determines what a user is and is not allowed to do. Authorization is usually coupled with authentication so that the server has some concept of who the client is that is requesting access. In some cases, there is no authorization. Any user may use a resource or access a file simply by asking for it. Almost all network security systems operate by allowing selective use of services. An ACL or access control list is a common means by which access to and denial of services is controlled. The terms authentication and authorization are often used interchangeably. While they may be often implemented together, the two functions are distinct. While authentication is the process of validating the identity of a registered user before allowing access to the protected resources, authorization is the process of validating that the authenticated user has been granted permission to access the requesting resources. The process by which access to those resources is restricted to a certain number of users is called access control. The authentication process always comes before the authorization process. Once we know who a user is and we know what authorization level they have and what we should and should not give them access to, we need to physically prevent that user from accessing anything that they should not be able to. Access control is the process of enforcing the required security for a particular resource. The goal of access control is to minimize the risk of unauthorized access to physical and logical systems. Access control is a fundamental component of security compliance programs that ensures security technology and access control policies are in place to protect confidential information. There are several different types of access control. They include mandatory access control, or MAC. This is the strictest option and is primarily used by the military or other government entities. The operating system firmly controls access to all doors based on settings created by the system administrator. With MAC, it's impossible for users to change permits that grant or deny entry to rooms throughout the facility. Discretionary access control, or DAC, is the default option for managing most access control systems. Unlike MAC, DAC allows administrators to make their own decisions about who can access which areas. With this system, each entry point has an access control list, or ACL, with groups or individual users who have permission to enter. Role-based access control, or RBAC, also called non-discretionary access control, restricts access to computer resources based on individuals or groups with defined business functions. This allows you to effortlessly assign permissions based on job titles. If an employee is promoted and another one is hired on to take their place, you can use their changing position within the company to assign key card access to the appropriate areas. Rule-based access control defines the rules that govern access to resource objects. Often these rules are based on conditions such as time of day or location. It is not uncommon to use some form of both rule-based access control and role-based access control to enforce access policies and procedures. Note that lack of adequate access control is more often the cause of security vulnerabilities in applications than faulty authentication or authorization mechanisms, simply because access control is more complex to implement and becomes more complex as the application being secured becomes more complex itself. Security threats are everywhere, and their effectiveness depends on how vulnerable a computer network is. In this context, vulnerability is identified as a flaw in our security which permits an assault on network resources. If left unchecked, network security vulnerabilities leave the network open for a variety of computer viruses and various types of hacker assaults. A network system is vulnerable for continual attacks if a weakness in security is present which enables network access, defect exploitation by hackers is allowed to continue undetected, or if system defects are known and can be exploited. Cybersecurity consists of technologies, processes, and measures that are designed to protect individuals and organizations from cybercrimes. Effective cybersecurity reduces the risk of a cyber attack through the deliberate exploitation of systems, networks, and technologies. The most common human mistakes in cybersecurity are clicking on links, opening unknown attachments, and entering personal or confidential information into a seemingly friendly and familiar account. These errors are driven by social engineering, a technique utilized by hackers to take advantage of human behavior in order to successfully pull off a scam. Often, people are the weakest link in any security infrastructure. Educating users on security awareness is a great way to build security-conscious environment. Insider threat is a term for a threat to an organization's security or data that comes from within. Such threats are usually attributed to employees or former employees, but may also arise from third parties, including contractors, temporary workers, or customers. Insider threats can take many forms, but threats can be categorized as either malicious or accidental. Accidental threats refer to situations in which damage or data loss occurs as a result of an insider who has no malicious intent. Malicious threats refer to deliberate attempts by an insider to access and potentially harm an organization's data, systems, or infrastructure. Processes are key to the implementation of an effective security strategy. Processes are crucial in defining how the organization's activities, roles, and documentations are used to mitigate the risk of an organization's information. Processes also need to be continually reviewed. Cyber threats change quickly and processes need to adapt with them, but processes are nothing if people don't follow them correctly. Technology is obviously crucial when it comes to cybersecurity. By identifying the cyber risk that your organization faces, you can then start to look at what controls to put in place and what technologies you'll need to do this. Technology can be deployed to prevent or reduce the impact of cyber risk, depending on your risk assessment and what you deem an acceptable level of risk. Security must be pervasive. Every aspect of a company should be security conscious. Employees need to understand the importance of security and the role they play in maintaining an effective security infrastructure. The first step in identifying the attacker is to determine all possible attack vectors within the network. An attack vector is a vulnerability that a malicious actor exploits to gain unauthorized access to an information system and its data. These vulnerabilities may be exploited actively or passively. Passive attacks are those that occur without being easily detectable. To conduct a passive attack, tools such as network sniffers, brute force attacks, or keystroke loggers may be used. Active attacks, however, will often result in altered system configurations or data being accessed, modified, or possibly exfiltrated. Active attack vectors may involve computing hardware or software operation systems, telecommunications, and human factors. Computing hardware equipment is often a target of attackers. When financial decisions are being made, it is easy to purchase cheaper technical equipment. This equipment is often created by manufacturers within nations that have weak information security policies. The biggest threat with these untrusted products are built-in backdoors. A backdoor allows access to a system and its data without following typical security mechanisms. While this may be used to allow for easier troubleshooting, it may also be exploited by attackers. The software that information systems could also be utilized as an attack vector. Software may encompass systems and applications. System software is the code that allows hardware to function properly, while application software is the code that allows tools to operate. Software vulnerabilities are security errors, glitches, or weaknesses that may be exploited. While most software contains vulnerabilities, some are more risky than others. Operating systems are the core of the computing environment, providing users a common and easy-to-use interface to the hardware and software installed on a computer. Exploits in operating system code wreak havoc on computers, giving hackers the ability to steal data and to damage both hardware and software. Since developers program and debug each operating system, hundreds of vulnerabilities are introduced in the code during development time. The telecommunications or telecom industry is the backbone of essential services that depend on connectivity. These include emergency response utility, transportation, and financial services. Telecommunication companies are targeted not only by script kiddies, but also advanced persistent threats looking to create widespread business and system disruption. These threats could potentially access data and systems that may compromise the telecom's operations, their customers, or even national security. As stated before, the most common mistakes made by people towards systems are clicking on links, opening unknown attachments, and entering personal or confidential information into a seemingly friendly or familiar account. Attribution is determining the identity, location, or an attacker's intermediary. Identifying attribution is very difficult because attackers rely on deception and a variety of obfuscation techniques to hide their identity. To determine the accurate actors responsible for a cyber attack, experts often conduct extensive forensic investigations, including analyzing digital forensic evidence and historical data, establishing intent or motives, and taking into account the overarching situation. However, one of the challenges of cyber attribution is that the attackers typically launch cyber attacks using computers or devices owned by other victims that the attacker has previously compromised. Identifying an attacker is also made more difficult because attackers can spoof their own IP addresses or use other techniques such as proxy servers to bounce their IP addresses around the world to confuse attempts at cyber attribution. Additionally, jurisdictional limitations can hinder attribution in cross-border cybercrime investigations because every time a law enforcement agency has to undertake an investigation that crosses borders, it must go through official channels to request help. This can hamper the process of gathering evidence, which must be collected as soon as possible. A vulnerability assessment is the process of defining, identifying, classifying, and prioritizing vulnerabilities in computer systems, applications, and network infrastructures, and providing the organization doing the assessment with the necessary knowledge, awareness, and risk background to understand the threats to its environment and react appropriately. The next two slides will show some of Canada's high, medium, and low risk vulnerabilities that currently exist on our system. The vulnerability assessment includes a detailed description of the vulnerability, the categorization, the threat it causes to the system, the date published and last revision, the affected system, the level of impact and assessment, as well as mitigation techniques. Vulnerability management is the process in which vulnerabilities are identified and the risk of these vulnerabilities are evaluated. This evaluation leads to correcting the vulnerabilities and removing the risk or a formal risk acceptance by the management of an organization. While there are countless new threats being developed daily, many of them rely on old security vulnerabilities to work. With so many malwares looking to exploit the same few vulnerabilities time and time again, one of the biggest risks that a business can take is failing to patch those vulnerabilities once they're discovered. The easy fix is to maintain a regular update schedule, a day of the week where your IT team checks for the latest security patches for your organization's software and ensures that they're applied to all of your company's systems. Email virus detection tools can be used to check email attachments for malware that can harm your network. Vulnerability assessments can be used to identify and close security risk. An educated employee is less likely to fall for phishing schemes than one who doesn't know basic cybersecurity protocols. Social engineering training helps to provide employees with basic knowledge that they need to identify and avoid phishing attacks. Enacting a policy of least privilege means restricting a user's access to the minimum amount needed to perform their job duties. This way, if that user's account privileges are misused, the damage will be limited. Knowing what the biggest threats to your business are is the first step to protecting your and your customers' sensitive data. However, it takes a lot of hard work, expertise, and diligence to minimize your security risk. This wraps up today's meeting. Thank you all for participating in our cybersecurity risk assessment. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to Team Canada. Thank you.